Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are in the world, and welcome to today's DevOps.com program, brought to you by Techstrong and Tricentis. My name is Cody J. Brown. I'm the host of Techstrong Learning, and we have an exciting presentation for you today. First, I do have just a couple of housekeeping notes to cover. Today's session is being recorded, so if you miss any of our discussion, or you'd like to rewatch or share with a friend, the on-demand recording will be made available shortly after we conclude our live session today. If you have any questions, and I'm sure you will, we want you to go ahead and send those in to us using the Q&A tab, which can be found on the right side of your screen. That's also where you're going to find the chat tab, and that's where we want you to get to know your fellow audience members. Let us know your thoughts throughout today's program, or maybe just let us know from where you are joining us. And of course, before we close, we will be giving away 4 $25 Amazon gift cards, so be sure to stick around for the duration of today's program. So our topic today is 10 steps to continuous performance testing in DevOps. And I'm joined by Kristen Webb, Director of Product Marketing at Tricentis, and Paul Bruce, Director of Customer Engineering at Tricentis Neoload. So Kristen, Paul, thank you both so much for joining me. I'm going to invite you to turn your cameras on and take it away from here.
Thank you. So we're really excited today to talk to you guys about 10 steps to continuous performance testing in DevOps. First, a quick intro. My name is Kristen Webb. I'm the Director of Product Marketing here at Tricentis, and I actually have a background in software development, working with software development teams for over a decade. And back in the day, we used to call performance testing looking for the watermelon. So today we're going to talk about not waiting till the end of the development cycle to look for the watermelon, but how to look for the small, changes that we can make all the time to deliver fast, reliable releases. And I'm here with my colleague, Paul Bruce. Paul?
Hey, Kristen. Thank you. So my name is Paul. I'm Director of Customer Engineering at Neotis. I help with a lot of customer field work. I'm occasionally on stuff like this, hopefully with some useful information that people can use from my fieldwork and also from my work in other communities like Boston DevOps and DevOps Days. Ultimately, this is a conversation, and as we go through, make sure that you actually put your questions into the chat. As we go along, we're going to be hitting a lot of topics really quickly. So if something sparks and strikes up, please put it into the Q&A, and we'll definitely deal with that.
Yeah, good point. Thanks for raising that, Paul. Please do, put your questions into the Q&A, and we will reserve, about 15 to 20 minutes at the end to answer any questions that come up throughout. So what we're going to talk about today, there's no question that enterprises want to integrate continuous performance testing in an automated pipeline, or in several types of automated pipelines. But from what we were hearing is a lot of people are finding it difficult to reconcile the mismatched clock speed approach of testing with today's super accelerated release cycles. So today we're going to talk about these field tested best practices approaches that Paul is seeing in the market and that he helps our customers and prospects with today. And how to get started with this continuous testing approach to, overcome blockers in an automated way. So we're going to talk about, today you'll learn more about how to gather the right metrics to assess your gaps, how to prioritize and then systematize across your application portfolio and what that means, how to plan for acceleration across the whole delivery cycle, not just performance engineers anymore, but the whole DevOps team, the whole organization, how to get them involved, and how to design concrete measurements with the end in mind, and picking the right targets to automate, making scripting easier for multiple teams, and using dynamic infrastructure, one of my favorites, for test environments. And then, in the end, what we all want to get to, which is ensuring trustworthy go, no-go decisions that you can rely on. So with that in mind, we will get started with number 1. So question for you, Paul. Gathering the right metrics to assess your gaps. How do people assess gaps, and what gaps are we talking about here?
Sure. So, like anybody who has a whole bunch of work to do, not all work is created equal. You got to figure out what to prioritize. And if you're going to prioritize the stuff, usually evidence helps, right? The things you can know about where your gaps might be. And I don't just mean at a practitioner level. I mean sort of at a portfolio, right? You'll definitely get copies. Don't worry, Fernando. Good question. The point though is like we work in more complicated situations than just stuff as an IC or an individual contributor that you can do. Sometimes, like for instance, these are not, by the way, best practices. I don't know about that. They're good practices, right? And some of these things are examples of what I've seen other people do. So like the metrics you might gather to say, okay, where are the gaps in the portfolio of all the different systems that we might be asked to help performance test? Or if you're a team and you've got a whole bunch of individual parts of your application, like what matters? So, yeah, failures in production might be a number that really matters to your organization. But, starting with stuff that's kind of like, that's the bad case scenario, might be the pain that people need to like make it real. But unfortunately, like that's not the earliest thing that you can look at. It just happens to be a really good metric to say, are we getting better or worse in our Sev ones or something like that, right? How about when you're looking at your broader organization and trying to say, what should we performance test and when and how do we start to layer this in early? Things like how many teams don't even have performance metrics in their definitions of done, right? Percent of coverage on workflows. How many, are we just testing only happy path? That's not at all what you do when you go over to the operational side of things. Right, you very quickly find that your happy paths are by far not the only things that happen. Percent of total revenue that this project is responsible for. What performance? If you're a performance engineer, when was the last time you asked the product team, "Hey, by the way, how much revenue is this thing responsible for?" Because if it's 0.001% of your total, revenue as a company, maybe it's different than if there's a critical system and application like, your checkout process or your claims management process, right? Those are probably far more important because of total revenue and because of the cost of when there's downtime or when there's rework to do and worse, like architectural rework. So I just put these out there to say, how often are you asking these questions? Because these questions matter to basically say, to get permission to start to put numbers on things. And we've got that people, process, and technology thing that comes from my work with DevOps. It's a three-body problem. It's like if you want to change a little bit the process, you're going to be affecting people and the technology. And if you're going to change technology, you're going to be doing the same. You're going to be making little changes, hopefully not grand, large changes all at once that are bound to fail, but meaningful improvements. But why are we thinking about this? Because that's the world we live in. And what we're doing is we're starting to see as an industry, things are getting more frequent. Right? It's not just the testing is getting more frequent. Why is that? Because the batches are getting smaller. We're doing more frequent adjustments to hopefully match what the user is looking for so that they will pay us more money, so that things will be better. So we will have less downtime and so on and so forth, right? That more continuous is where a lot of the industry is going. Doesn't mean everybody's going to ship it right out to production, but being more frequent and continuous on things is a key theme in the industry and in our customer base.
Yeah, so, I think that really helps, like what you just said, identify what the first step is with assessing the gaps. What do we do with once we have all this information,
Yeah, so it goes into the
projects and apps and services in our organization. Where do we start with that?
It goes into the last slides, the questions, which was basically like, have a little guts, like be willing to ask these questions that typically sometimes people might not ask. And once you do that, now all of a sudden you're like, okay, you have a little permission to get some information on the table, but just a kind of a different lens, right? How would you prioritize across a large portfolio? Now, if you talk to product teams, they might tell you about various different frameworks they use to measure and manage and kind of estimate and guess, like RICE, reach, impact, confidence, and effort. These are characteristics that they have to put some kind of numbers on in order to score and scale. Well, as a performance engineer, I love Brendan Gregg's enterprise performance in the cloud. It's a big fat book, and it's chock full of really good stuff. It's on my shelf here somewhere. But one of the framings that he uses specifically about how to measure meaningful information from the server side, like maybe you put some load on something, or maybe there's load, and what's happening on the server side or the services. He uses a framing called utilization, saturation, and errors. And if I may just kind of bend that a bit, that's a really cool framing, but it doesn't just apply to servers. We could actually step back and apply this to those questions that we were asking to start to get the right information and to be able to start scoring and saying, from a utilization perspective, right, what core APIs, microservices, what applications are ballooning their usage or are anticipated to increase their usage significantly? Like, when COVID happened and then the colleges shut down, a lot of the vendors of software for education systems went, oh my goodness, I guess we are staying virtual for quite a while, which means we're going to have a huge demand. So we got a double, triple, 3x times test in production overnight, white knuckles, all that stuff, right? But the utilization and the saturation of these systems are the things that we're looking for to say, we need to spend more time on this one and not as much time on that one. And the errors coming from your systems, it's very easy to skim over errors and they're in a log, but nobody's looking at it. If they're visualized, if these things are actually visualized, not just with the load tool, but maybe with your monitoring or your APM or your observability tooling, right? It's very important to have this up in front of people to be able to say, how should we prioritize this? Look, this is the utilization and saturation on this service is way higher than this one. And it's causing more errors and it's causing us more. And it'll connect with what they know, which is those overnight on-call Sev1 type things, right?
Paul, what I love about this slide and what you're saying here is it resonates with so many people, so many of our customers that I've talked to too, is, in a microservices-based architecture, one service could bring down so many others or so many other applications that it's using. And oftentimes, one of the biggest pains these customer has is knowing what should they do performance test first. Because if they could be performance testing all day, but if they're not hitting the right things, then having a go or a no-go isn't as relevant. So this is super helpful.
Yeah, and the other thing I see a lot is people wanting to go faster. But you can go faster and run right into a brick wall. Is that what people want? No. It's not just the speed at which you go, it's the direction. So this gives you some early sort of, let's figure out what the direction across a big portfolio and these large customers. But really the next step is to kind of talk about, okay, well, this isn't just about doing the big fat testing at the end. This is all about planning. Okay, once you have a plan, what do you do with it? So moving on to the next one.
Yeah, so once you have those priorities in check, what prevents teams from effectively implementing these performance automation techniques that you're talking about?
Yep. This is one of those rare circumstances. I think that these four things on this slide can both act as, when you don't have them in there, they're blockers, right? When you don't have something in an optimal situation here, that's a blocker. But also, if you start to optimize, it becomes not just a source for less toil, it actually helps you reduce toil on a regular basis. So I was just talking with a team yesterday where they're like, we'd like to auto magic our SLAs. And I'm like, okay, let's walk through how you derive them now. Oh, well, at the end of the day, it's all about conversations. Okay, well, what's going wrong in those conversations? Well, we don't get the right information up front. Non-functional requirements, how about this? How about call them operational requirements, right? As soon as you say non-functional, it sounds like it's not as important as functional. Okay, well, right, you need to have an intake process that helps people articulate what they know and be okay and have a gap for when you don't know, right? What your peak usage, what your peak ratios are. The other thing is that if you want to run a race, right, you're typically not just, we were talking about this before the webinar, running races, it's like you don't just do a 5K without any experience, without any prep work, without any exercise in advance. It's not just about stretching last minute and then running, right? You kill yourself if you go on a 5K without any kind of exercise beforehand. So these are the things that help you, and that's what the shoelaces tied, right, is all about, is helping you with these specific things be ready to run this race across many portfolios when it actually gets to larger scale testing. Certainly having clear and communicated goals, things like SLOs, right? In my mind, SLAs are all about legal requirements. SLOs are about operational requirements, right? Availability and uptime, and what happens if we slip those goals. SLIs, on the other hand, are indicators. So
I think it might be helpful to have this up for people as you're talking through those, those types of outcomes.
So but to be able to have a structure, a basic format to say, like an information hierarchy, like what are we really talking about here, right? Is an SLA just about how quickly requests come back? No, that's an indicator, because that thing will vary. Performance engineers know that kind of varies day to day, hour by hour and stuff. But what really matters is putting that into the context of the operational requirements and the objectives of that service. If your CPU NetRAM disk is going a little hot, it's the first early indicator to say maybe that's going to cause some slip when it comes to our availability or uptime or high-level performance characteristics, which indeed may actually mean that we are we're starting to slip our legal bounds on some kind of contract between third parties. So that's what I mean by design concrete measurements with the end in mind as well. Don't just accept some team saying, oh, well, I guess my requests, I don't know, I'm going to put a value in some form that you've given me just because I have to fill it out. No. You can try that out, but then that quickly becomes the baseline, as the team was saying. If they just ask you to run a load test and see what the performance is, and you say, well, it's like this, and then they just plug that number in as, I guess that's the baseline, that's not a proper way to take decisions. You need to provide advisement over that. And one of the structures, the constructs to help that conversation would be the SLAs, SLOs, and SLIs that come from of other places, amongst other places. The Google SRE mindset is let's get more concrete about these things.
Yeah, and what you're outlining here, Paul, I think is super helpful for people who are looking to migrate, either whether that's migrating cloud or migrating to a new architecture. And so building out this approach before they migrate and having this understanding of what their metrics are today and what they need to hit, and building out this practice will help them in their migrations.
That's a great point. Yeah, I totally missed that. You're absolutely right about the migration part. You've got these services deployed in some weird data center configuration, and now everybody wants to press the cloud button.
Yeah.
There are some serious considerations that I don't think we have tons of time today.
Yeah, we'll do that in our next webinar.
Yeah, but I mean, that's a perfect example of you have to plan your work and work your plan and be willing to adjust that plan and improve it. And one of the improvements to a conversation you might actually have to make meaningful, concrete statements that you can then go and test for would be to use a structure like this. Yeah. Did we miss anything on that last slide, by the way?
No, I think we're good. And so with all this in mind, which systems are likely candidates for this kind of iterative, automated approach to performance testing?
Yeah. So I put this little table together just to indicate sort of this might be the way. You might have a different table, right? On the top, there are some columns that say, hey, have tests been created? Even just like, API or functional basic tests, right? Have they been created at all? Is the system deploy ready? And I don't mean like deploy to production ready. I mean like, can it transition from works on my machine dev, who knows, Phoenix project bullcrap to a system, maybe you stand up some VMs in the cloud or on your premise, OpenShift or something. Can it transition from a jumble of mess in dev environment to an actual other environment pretty seamlessly? Because when they have to redeploy changes, that process happens all over and over again, especially in more safe release train cycles, right? What's your relationship with the product team look like? From a performance engineering, it's the same thing with security, right? Security, you should probably think about, hey, do I have a good relationship with this team? Or I'm just saying no all the time. And the same thing with performance. How often have I had, as a performance engineer, had engagements with them where I know a little bit about it? Is this the first time? Is there a lot of context and trust and relationship and confidence that we have to build? Or is this already like established with this team? And also to be more continuous means to put things out of your brain into a process that some computer or CI system or orchestrator can do on your behalf. And that means pipelines these days. Are you using source code management to store all of your assets, which, by the way, when you try to automate things, not only does your app code have to be in a proper source code management system, but also your test assets, your test data, and so on and so forth. So are those stored in a place where you can reasonably put a pipeline in place and let that run on your behalf and give you some early feedback and signals? So those are just some of the questions I would probably walk into an engagement and just ask, how likely is it that we're going to make some meaningful progress on moving towards more continuous and better performance conversation, right? And maybe a mobile API team, might be one of those things. APIs are easy to deploy most of the time. You can mock and stub out third-party stuff. Customer billing APIs, right? Maybe be the same situation. Might have different inputs like Postman or some other testing tool. And it might need a little bit more of a transition, a formal transition to get it into an environment. But again, we're not just talking about environments that are huge production-like things, just to be able to start your race, to start performance testing on that thing and get a sense for what are the obvious problems up front, and then when you transition to production, if you're not taking care of those obvious problems, they're going to show up and it's going to be like sweeping stuff under the rug and having a huge pile of a mess to deal with late cycle. We don't want that. So let's get the early and obvious things out of the way. APIs are a perfect example. There's plenty of undiscovered and uncovered, right, and undercovered surface area in an organization, in an enterprise, in the API stack. And then just to point out the last part, right, the mobile app. Okay, so I worked in mobile application development for a while and with various different people. And though there's a lot of great stuff going on there, to be able to deploy that thing in a way that you can reasonably actually test from a performance perspective might also encounter more complex and more environment blockers than your typical API or your typical web app. So, if let's say the mobile app team isn't really using pipelines to do their build, release, and deploy, right, and sandbox publishing up to a sandbox environment is really slow, then that might not be the first and obvious candidate. It's good to know what their situation is. It's important to have information across your grid about these things, these characteristics that matter per project. But are they always going to be the ones that are the thing you execute on immediately? There might also be an imperative from the organization column, right? Like an urgency or an imperative that kind of changes the equation here.
All right. Well, this is great to have a framework for getting started and prioritizing. Who's doing all this work? I mean, is this, in the day, it was always this architect or this performance engineering expert. Who is it today doing all this work?
Well, there's lots of different works, right? This one says make scripting easy for multiple teams. That's one area of work. Analysis is another area of work. The more complex your system is and the more elaborate that you have to kind of put pressure on it to really expose some of the issues with it, the more complex the analysis might be. And then there's a lot of the, like, even if you do find problems with something, who's going to fix them? The devs are going to fix them, right? Maybe they fix them and maybe they make it worse. And so you have to test and retest, right? So there are some of these types of things that need early involvement from maybe subject matter experts in the planning process, like we were talking about the first couple of slides. There might be, okay, well, the devs aren't necessarily going to do the performance scripting, maybe, right? In a lot of enterprises at scale, they have subject matter experts, or they have a team of people that will do the scripting for them. Sure, they get engaged, and they might have to get engaged earlier. But making that whole process easier, less toil, nobody disagrees that that would be beneficial, right? Efficiency is great. Effectiveness, pointed in the right direction about the right projects at the right times, is also necessary. So at the very least, if we just take the aspect of scripting to answer your question, Kristen, from my perspective, it doesn't particularly matter who does the scripting on a particular workflow. And there's many ways to do that. Is it the right workflow? That's a decision that's going to need collaboration and communication. I think we need to.
Not sure why that happened. Let me go back to the slide, but you can keep going.
Virtual, the other thing that might be is that, oh my goodness, there might be somebody, strangely enough, from the dev cycle, right? Maybe a developer, maybe some kind of release engineer, some ops, DevOps person, or some SRE that wants to do a little bit of early performance checks, right? Even in lower environments. You don't want to discourage them from that. You don't want to put something that's like, it takes weeks to understand in front of them. No, and in fact, you want to encourage and that excitement, that interest, but it might not be them that carry it all the way through to the more blown out full test data, all the workflows and ratios and the workload modeling might not be them the whole time, but you don't want to discourage that. So make some of the scripting easy for multiple teams. Multiple teams include multiple types of people, right? It's not
right, and that could be anything from like using the command line interface to a GUI interface, or
it could mean code. Yeah, it could mean code. It could mean some markup. It could mean a whole bunch of different things. But you got to really work with them and build sort of an easy path in to get rid of the obvious and easy stuff. I mean, if the APIs are so ready and available and easy, then why not just let the product teams start in on some of that work quickly, and maybe even automatically generated from some of the artifacts like open API specs? That would be pretty cool, right? That's what we're in the business to help with, is to automate that toil away a bit. But it doesn't mean that you're not going to be doing the bigger things or the more elaborate things at the end. It's minimum viable stuff that can get early feedback.
Great. Well, let's talk more about pipelines, like, and what you mean by guardrails. I think I heard you say that a couple of times.
Yeah. So there's this myth that there's this one big monolithic pipeline that's going to do all the things. Some sort of like take from the raw sources and then spin up all the servers and deploy the stuff, build it, deploy it, package it, blah, 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 blah. And what? Transition those servers rotate them into production? No, there are transition points. There are, as Eliyahu Goldratt in the goal might indicate, there is a sequence of events that oftentimes occurs, and these pipelines are a sequence of events. If you've got the global high level concept of the big delivery process, great, right? But that delivery process breaks down, even if it doesn't have performance testing in it, it always breaks down into 150 different steps that all themselves do individual things. So here we see an example of where I say, hey, look, in your broader process, you might be doing these big high level pieces, but let's say the performance or load testing itself is its own piece that deserves its own logistics and semantics. You might, for instance, once you get to the point where you deployed the thing, you could do some of these things in parallel. Security and performance can be running in parallel, right? They're usually not mutually mutually exclusive in many cases, and only some rare combination of cases. So you can do those things separately. But when you go off and do, let's say, an automated load test as part of a build process, there's a whole bunch of sub steps. Like, you got to pull the test assets, you got to prepare the environment, you got to spin up some things maybe, or reach out to our Elastic stuff, right? You've also got to you want a consistency of output, even though different products, different targets that you're testing. You want the process to be consistent and do the thing the way it's supposed to be done, error out properly, not provide false positives, and at the end produce reports and results and stream metrics in a similar fashion to the other pipelines for the other projects in your portfolio. You want a consistency of that kind of stuff. So
there's a lot of parallels with security testing and performance testing, actually. So
yeah,
I talk about that a lot. It's not only just philosophically, even, because if people aren't doing it regularly as part of this continuous pipeline, then they're finding out by accident, and the repercussions of that is so dire. So it's good that you put them together.
And one of the things that is common in most of these cases, no matter what, whether it's a static scan or a linter or a performance check or unit tests, whatever it is, ultimately it has to boil up back to the pipeline to say, is this a go or a no-go? And performance testing, lots of big data comes from that. SLAs, right? Thresholds around what is acceptable and not being summarized can help you drive better towards a more summary go, no go, but it's not the only things, right? There could be additional automated processes that take it in, do your custom reports, pull out the key things that that happened on the server side, and produce that into custom reports for those teams. So there is some analysis you can automate, but there's always a need in some cases to help inform and make meaningful action for these things that do require human beings after the fact. At the very least, we should be able to ship that early feedback loop with some of the easy and automated analysis in there, and then give you the chance to work with that team to say, hey, it was a no-go, and there were more deeper problems with this, and let's go through that together, right?
Let's talk about where the environments that people are doing this with. One of the biggest, most expensive parts of load testing is the infrastructure, and accessing it, keeping it, setting it up, deprovisioning it. So how are we seeing that change?
Sure. Well, cloud has done a lot of things for us, right? It's made it so that we can just reach out and get resources when we want to. And then the bill comes at the end of the month and you're like, whoops.
It can be a real Band-Aid, right, to performance issues.
Yeah. And before we even talk about just the infrastructure required to put pressure on a system in a load test, I mean, just think about the systems that are in your cloud environments that have these like fancy, auto scaling will save us. The cloud will save us. No, it won't. First off, you have to verify that those mechanisms are actually doing what they're supposed to do, i.e. put pressure on things, at least in the early stages, to figure out, did my configuration of the auto scale really do what it wanted to do? What are you going to wait for customers to show up? And that's not going to work? No. So that's why load testing is so important, right? In these cloud environments, but also shared environments, whether it's a private cloud or public cloud or dedicated resources, there's all these undocumented, you don't know about them until like governors in the cloud to prevent other people and the rest of the data centers from Amazon and Google and Microsoft to be able to satisfy your needs without interrupting something else. And usually that comes in the form of rate limiting, right, or resource limiting. So you don't know what you don't know until you test. Side note. Secondly, when it comes to load tests, yes, the whole point of a load test is not to use the system under test to test itself. It's to take resources and put pressure on that system, and those resources be healthy enough and available enough. And the traditional model was to fax your IT person and get 40 servers for a big fat test, only to find that it's a once-a-year budgeting cycle. Oops. Or you rush that thing, and now you have 40 servers that are like sitting around doing nothing half the time. And you really only use 5 to 10 on a regular basis? No, come on. We could do better, especially with the cloud. So classic infrastructure was all about like just keeping things around and, having things just doing nothing most of the time and wasting. And your CFO looks at you like, are you a cost center? Like, what is this? What is this fleet that you don't use? So the next phase of that would be to say, you know what, let's lift and shift a little bit of that type of stuff onto the cloud. And then we can like more programmatically turn things on and off. Well, that's better, but you're still dealing at the whole virtual machine level. You're taking an entire thing at a unit of measure that's big just to be sitting around. So we transition, once you're on the cloud, you have all sorts of really cool things. And even not just cloud, but on-prem, like OpenShift, right? Various Rancher. These are ways to manage and help provide management layer over Kubernetes clusters that are all about containers, smaller units of measure over how much do we really need when we're doing this type of payload, this type of workload. And in our case, a workload comes from your test, but it's executed by a load generator. So how big do these load generators really need to be? I was talking with a customer a year ago, and they were like, well, because of the thing that we were with, it was these huge special Snowflake servers that had like 64 cores, and it was like hundreds of gigabytes of memory. And it's like, why were you doing that? Well, because we found that the tooling couldn't support connecting to more than like 5 or 6 things at a time without causing trouble. That's a dysfunction, right? You should be able to move to these cloud resources and split them up and make them smaller and make it more cost effective, and maybe even take advantage of some elastic things like an AWS Fargate, right? Or Elastic Container Network, or Google Kubernetes Engine, right? Where they can back themselves with either static hardware or dynamic containers that you get from that and get charged a different model. It's more for the CPU and the total time of that container, not for the fixed cost of a VM that's always running. So we're just making this cost and the asks a bit smaller when we start to move to more dynamic infrastructure for testing environments, right? And they're immutable. That's the great thing. Once you go away from these servers that sit around doing nothing all day and somebody remotes onto them when you don't know, and they change a bunch of configuration, and then tomorrow your tests don't work, what's going on there, right? On the entire flip side, things like containers and using infrastructure as code ensures that what's in the recipe for how to set that thing up is a code artifact. And if somebody changed that, it's not because they're going on into a container or a server and twiddling with that thing. It's they're going through a process of how to create the recipe right. And if a recipe is code, it's auditable, it's rollback, like there's rollback capabilities and stuff like that. So we're seeing a lot of customers move to that elastic model for the two reasons of both cost as well as immutable infrastructure, and having more control over, their fleet is not always on anymore. And it's also more regulated. It's more consistent. So.
Well, Paul, we could talk about this all day. This is super interesting. But we did promise our attendees that we would spend 15 to 20 minutes on Q&A. So we have 2 more steps. So just like a minute or 2 on each would be great. This is coming to the conclusion that we want it to, which is reliable, go, no go decisions. Tell us about this in like a minute or less.
Okay. So you can't expect a computer to know magically what's important and what's not. I mean, even with the fancy ML and AI that's all over the market, it still needs to be informed by doing work and having a history of work. So in many cases, we're not there yet, like when it comes to an industry of like how to just auto magic performance away. I don't think we want to do that. I think we want to be more invested in understanding how our systems behave. So with that in mind, when you get these pipelines going, right, the process is usually run that first test, realize that there are some things going wrong, fix those things, rerun the test, less problems, maybe 1 or 2 more, fix those, and then you're done. Maybe a couple of cycles here and there, right? Out of those cycles, each of those should produce meaningful go, no go signals. How to get a computer to know what meaningful means, at least in a performance world, is as it can be easily mapped to, am I providing proper thresholds, right? SLAs, SLOs, SLIs, not just in the plan, but in the artifacts that are part of the test. So we're working very, very quickly and closely to figure out how to rapidly be able to help you with that whole notion of SLAs and thresholds in an automated fashion. But it does take work, right? It does take some conversation up front with your teams.
Yep, this is where the money is. So to wrap up, when you're saying drive organizational awareness and scale of success, this is where everybody wants to get to. They want to be able to keep pace with development and scale.
Yep.
So if you could just summarize this really quickly, that'd be great.
Yeah, the explore, expand, extract, at least most recently, you can look at Kent Beck and amongst other things, he's very known to have this idea where, you're doing a lot of little things at first when you don't really know how to get to something, but you need options on the table. You need to figure things out. You're doing a lot of little explores, a lot of little POCs, prototypes, things like that. And what we're seeing with companies that are moving from this sort of, hit the glass ceiling with just 2 or 3 experts that don't have enough time to cover all these things, and trying to move that to more of a team that can not only advise, but also disseminate that information. The next step is when you do have a pattern that works, right? What we work very closely with our customers to identify what is going to work for you in your environment. The next thing is to expand it, right? Is to expand on that thing and start building out the patterns and practices that multiple people, multiple teams can take advantage of. And ultimately to be able to get to a point where you're like, hey, I think we struck gold. I think we have a pattern that is producing meaningful action, outputs, and performance mindset in this slightly broader set of the portfolio. Let's move forward. That requires buy-in by various different VPs and execs. So, you're just doing your coding down at the bottom. Just understand that the value there, if it's not socialized and you're not an advocate for the benefits that are coming out of it, nobody else is going to be. So it's up to you. It's up to your, at mid-level management to take the successes, the early successes, not just inside your team, but as your team serves other people and other teams, their successes as well are your successes. And so when you get to the point where you're like, okay, let's extract the value of this gold that we struck, let's do this in a more repeatable manner. That's the type of stuff that we're getting into now with the customers that have been on board for like a year or so. They got through the early and obvious stuff. They've changed and shifted and adjusted their culture. We remember people, process, technology, and now they're ready to run, right? Some of them are a lot in the expand phase, and some of them are even in the extract phase here. And that's where you can start to improve and build on those improvements over time.
Well, you've given everybody a lot to think about. And speaking of customers, let's get to everybody's attendee questions. I've heard there's a lot of questions now. Thank you so much, Paul. I'm going to put this back up. This is the list of steps that we just went through. So as we go through the Q&A, you guys can reference this and see if it jogs any memories of questions that you had that you forgot to type in. So
yeah. Thanks, Kristen and Paul, for sharing your process with us. We did get a good number of questions that came in, and we'll try to get to as many as we can. We had one that came in from Ravi. How do we test third-party APIs performance, and how are we ensuring the performance are not affected by third-party services?
Sure. So that starts with agreement with that third party. You should get a copy of the SLA. I'm not kidding. The legal agreement that was signed. And if there is no legal agreement, then congratulations. You're not going to be able to test that. That's going to be really complicated. And you're not going to expect a lot out of them, but there's probably a legal agreement when somebody signs that says. The problem with those legal agreements is they usually don't say, we promise that our response time will be no more than X. And so you get back to the point where Ravi was asking was, how do we test these things? How do we prove them? First thing is start monitoring them, right? Get an average at very low volume. Just what is their average response time? And then you might end up in a situation where if you need to do a test against them, you usually have to schedule that with them. That's a conversation with that team. And especially if it's a SaaS and cloud provider, they probably don't like to have those things because it's a trust us mentality. But if you really still need to do that, and there are some customers who had problems moving to a third party, then yeah, I mean, certainly craft those API tests and be at the ready, because you can often say, hey, look, we need to run these proof of concepts on you to prove it, right? And what time, what schedule would you like us to do that? Don't assume that you can or can't. Assume that you can, and say it like that. And then they're going to go, oh boy, maybe we need to get the right people on the call and let's talk about this. And you'll get more information on the table. Challenges and problems are just a good source of information. So start there.
Okay. Great.
We have one from Fernando. What about functional test? Unit test is usually done by the development team. What if you had an independent test team?
What about functional tests? So different types of tests serve different goals. A unit test does not serve the same goal as a functional. Same thing in the functional does not serve the same goal as performance, right? The goal of performance is to exercise the system and understand more about its behavior under various different types of pressure, right? Variation policies and stuff like that. A functional test job might include things like check to see if that button is still green. That's not a performance problem. So just to highlight that the goals are different from these things, but in some cases, hey, if we've got a functional script that exercises a workflow like this, even though it cares about its own functional things, it's exercising a workflow in a browser. So we've got a couple of different solutions on the Neoload side, and also on the Tosca side now in Tricentis, to be able to take some of those functional assets and quickly put those and transfer those and create highly scalable protocol scripts that you can use at large volume. And some of our features allow you to rapidly script those out without having to do search and replace every single time. I hope that answered the question.
Yeah, very good. We have one from Parul. What are your suggestions on running performance tests on Git-based triggers?
Performance test on Git-based triggers makes it a little sound like this is not probably the case, but that your Git trigger is the system under test. That's not. It's probably how do you trigger things from a Git-based workflow. The good news is we have a command line interface that's just a shell command. And a lot of these different CI systems, oh man, they want you to be so sticky. Right? When I say sticky, they want you to write your pipeline not only in their domain-specific language, but also use all the fancy plugins that come from who knows where, right? The wide world of who cares, just so that it's hard. I mean, it might simplify things a little bit, but it ends up being that you don't really know what that thing does under the sheets until you have to, and then that's a problem. So Neoload, when you're running performance tests, it applies to GitLab, GitHub Enterprise, Jenkins, basically anything that can run Azure DevOps, right? Anything that can run a shell script can run a load test, can kick off a load test. But usually you're messaging our platform to say, please do this thing for me. And your pipeline semantics are better for it, right? Because it's just a couple of calls with the CLI to do this thing up at the platform, whether it's SaaS or whether you have an on-prem situation, right? We support both models, but from your Git pipeline, for instance, you can very easily trigger a test, and it's just a couple of shell commands, right? Just like AWS CLI, just like kubectl is a CLI, just like any of these proper CLIs. Azure has AZ, right? Should be very easy to articulate what you're trying to accomplish as lines in a release process, and that usually means rather than having to rely on plugin like this weird ecosystem of plugins, that you can just use our shell commands. Just keep in mind too, if you're thinking, oh, I use Git today, don't worry. You're either going to have a team that doesn't want to do that. Maybe they want to use Circle CI or Harness or whatever, right? Or maybe you do have to support multiple things because your organization is transitioning a lot from, let's say, on-prem Jenkins to, let's say, Azure or some kind of cloud-based thing. So you're not only going to have to support one CI in your career in that particular place. You're usually going to have to support more than one. And it's nice to have simple shell-based semantics with our CLI that literally look the same regardless of what pipeline you're using, what pipeline model you're using.
Very good. We have one from Robert. Can you spread the load across multiple cloud regions around the globe?
Yes. Especially with our cloud-based offerings. If you don't want to do the pain and suffering of having to make sure all your infrastructure is perfectly set up and ready to go, we've got cloud solution for that. Yeah.
Great. And we have one from Dinesh. How do you justify initial investment to move PT to a CI/CD pipeline? Because it requires more observability, monitoring compared to traditional testing cycles.
Well, I have a few friends that I've made over the couple of years who are named Dinesh. So I'm just going to assume that it's one of you that have asked this, which is great. It's a great question, right? First off, don't boil the ocean, right? Yeah, you know that there is a bigger landscape that you have to, there needs to be a strategy, and there's going to be multiple stakeholders and buy-in and all sorts of stuff. And yeah, it's going to take man hours and full-time and some people, and it's going to take collaboration with it. All that stuff, that's the later picture. That's your horizon 2 or 3, right? Your horizon 1 right now should start with 1 team or 2 teams, right? Two people, 2 groups that you serve, and you're in a place where you're serving them in a way where you're like, wow, there's a lot of toil to this process, and I really wish there wasn't. And so that's the opportunity to create like a call it a prototype, call it a POC, right? And start with a realistic and limited scope, and don't not capture what you know is outside that scope. You still want to have that, but you want to be very clear about the scope of what you're doing, moving something is usually typically more elaborate than unit tests as a performance testing or load testing process is, right? There are some building blocks, and I've got some webinars in the past. We can send those links along as well that help you think through what are the building blocks I need during a simple prototype, and what are the building blocks I'm going to have that's more reliable in place if we scale this out to a much larger audience. So start small. We're always willing to, Dinesh, I'm always willing to have a quick conversation to help you scope that, so that the thing that you're asking for agreement and approval on does not look like a massive thing, but keeps that in mind. But the immediate thing is reasonable and sized and scoped. We do this all the time. So I'm happy to support you.
These are some good questions. We had another question come in from Pranan. What are the best next steps for building out skills in my team to automate performance testing like you've discussed?
Well, I do have a ton of different workshops and webinars. But in general, right, separate from load or whatever testing, I think definitely providing some space in these people's schedule, providing air cover, but expecting progress, right? It's one thing to say, you know what, we're so busy we don't have time to learn anything new. No, you got to take time to make time, or make time to take time. Something that the Merovingian says in the Matrix, but it made sense at the time. The point is, you do have to have a small, and I would suggest maybe carving out a couple of hours a week just to say, you know what, I am devoted. I'll go somewhere else. I will turn off Slack. I will turn off my phone a little bit, speaking of, and I will actually work through some of these things. I'll set a small and concrete goal. I will work towards that. And oh, by the way, as individual contributors building their skills up, right? Also being able to report back, not only just to the manager, what did you do with that time? No, it's to report back to the team. Don't managers want teams that are excited and lean forward about how to accomplish the thing? Yeah. So it's not just about reporting up to your manager. I justify my time spent because I learned X, Y, and Z in the 2 hours that I was given. No, it's like you want to share those learnings with the team. Some of the best customers and the more lean forward culture in those customers that we have are people who regularly do biweekly or monthly roundtable share discussions. And it's not just about demo and everybody else sits on the call on mute. No, you talk, you collaborate, meaningful conversation matters in your culture. But getting back to like, how do we actually skill up? If a manager has to provide a little bit of air cover to give a little bit of deep work time that is not constantly having to also do emails and stuff like that, and to respect that and say we have to provide a little bit of deep work time That's what you should be spending your time on, and then bring those learning back to the group. That's important.
Very good. We had one from Jason. How do you know you can trust Go decisions?
It takes time. Trust takes time. Not to get like philosophical, but trust is important, and trust is earned. So when you're starting out these POCs, right, you're making a lot of assumptions up front, and some of those assumptions, like rough edges on a wooden piece, have to be sanded off before you expect it to be safe. So it's going to take a little time in the prototyping phase to get to a place where you know how your new process works, you know what to expect from your new system. The conversation I was talking about, SLAs, SLIs, SLOs, my conversation with the team yesterday, all about the way that you would get to a point where you have facts on the table about how to make SLAs in place, is a process that takes time. So if you're asking the question of how can we be confident in go no go decisions, the first one is don't boil the ocean. Try to avoid providing false positives at all costs, right? It's okay to have a definite success or definite failure, but there's a middle area, right? And don't report that middle area of, I don't know if this is a success or not, as a success. That's going to be the number one way that you only know a week or 2 weeks or a month later that it was telling you that it was okay when it was not. And vice versa, if you have way too many false positives of like fail, 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 you need to pay attention to those things, right? You need to be able to quickly prioritize going over that thing and saying, what thresholds are so tight that they're saying that the test is failed when it's not really that bad, right? That conversation about thresholds is very important in this context. So it's going to take time, and that's why I say start with 1 or 2 pilot teams. Once you learn and sand the edges off of what things work and how things work and what kind of conversations you have to have meaningful inputs so that they work more properly, and how often you need to adjust those. The next step is to roll that out, not to the whole organization, just to another set of people with maybe different products, different constraints, different deployment environments to do that. And then you can start to think, okay, now those successes can transition more effectively to the broader organization. Thank you for the questions.
Yeah, there's great engagement from the audience. So it looks like we're nearing the top of the hour. Didn't know if you guys had some last comments that you'd like to wrap up.
So I just wanted to wrap up. Thank you, Paul, for your insights today and for answering these questions. There is a white paper on this topic that we have on tricentis.com. You'll find it in the resources section. So if you wanted to dig in more to what we talked about today, you can also request a demo to see how we do this with Neoload with our customers today. We have a page on tricentis.com that you can learn more about all the integrations we have with the CI/CD pipelines and DevOps tool chains and our as-code feature set and all the things that enable people to do the 10 steps that we talked about today. We do have other webinars that you can watch recordings of and future ones coming up that you can see on our resources page. And then recently, Tricentis launched a Transformation in 10 podcast. Please listen in. We are having a focus on performance testing in August, so there'll be quite a few podcasts on that topic then.
Well, Kristen and Paul, thank you so much for joining us today. We really appreciate you stopping by and sharing your expertise with us. And I'd also like to thank Rochelle for moderating our Q&A today. It saves me a little bit of work, so I really appreciate it. So I would like to remind our audience today that this session was recorded. So following this panel, you'll receive an email with a link to access the recording on demand, or you can find the recording living on the DevOps website at devops.com/webinars. And just be sure to look in the on-demand section. So we do still have those 4 $25 Amazon gift cards to give away. Our winners are Erica D, Peter L, John D, and Diane D. So to the 4 of you, congratulations. please keep an eye on your inbox to claim that gift card. But if you don't happen to see that email, just check your spam folder. So to Kristen and Paul, thank you once more. I would like to thank Tricentis for sponsoring today's webinar. And of course, before we close, I would love to thank you, our audience. We appreciate you spending time with us this afternoon, and we would just like one more moment of your time for a brief survey that will pop up on your screen here in a second. But otherwise, we hope to see everyone at an upcoming Techstrong Learning workshop or webinar. Everyone, have a great rest of your day.